lost the art of concentrating. It doesn't matter what you're learning. You need concentration to learn. You could be learning how to edit a YouTube video or Pythagoras theorem, but without concentration, that ain't going in.
Eliza Filby is a generational historian and Sunday Times best-selling author of the book Meritocracy.
Let's not slap labels on generations, Gen Z are lazy, entitled. I think there's a real divide within the millennial demographic between those that grew up with FaceTime and those that didn't.
She's here to tell you why your career, your money, and your sense of success might not be what you think they are.
The more educated you are doesn't necessarily correlate with your income.
Only 12% of millennials want their kids to go to university.
We are moving away from the career ladder.
She studied the boomers, the zoomers, and the generation that's coming next.
There's a level of ignorance and assumption that comes with age that doesn't come with race, doesn't come with gender, doesn't come with disability. People will say things about different generations or different ages that they wouldn't say about.
Make sure you subscribe so we can continue to get bigger and bigger guests. Eliza, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs again.
Great to be back.
What is your job?
I've never said that on a podcast, by the way. Great to be back. Nice to be asked again.
Nice to be asked again. Bit of a different scenario we're filming in this time. What is your job?
Oh, that's a really hard first question. It's a job I made up, basically. I was an academic and I had an urge to disseminate my research, my thoughts, my ideas to a wider audience. And so I became a historian of generational change.
Yeah.
And it's a self-appointed title. All the best ones are. And I created the job I wanted, which was I want to understand how society is changing. Yeah. And I want to help as many people, businesses, individuals, whatever, understand that and understand the world they're operating in.
Because one of the phrases that you've used in the past as well is like historian of consumption as well, which I think is fascinating.
I've moved on.
I've moved on. But how has it evolved over the years, your job?
That's a great question. I think unconsciously. It's evolved in... I started my sort of kind of career as a researcher. I was a researcher and then I did a PhD and then I became an academic and I wrote an academic book and it was about a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of history. And I've gradually got broader and broader and broader into the things I'm interested in, whether it's, the evolution of trad wives or Nanacore on TikTok or how Gen Z are seeing wages and wealth differently, right through to crypto, right through to, obviously how those generational conflicts and frustrations are playing out in the workplace. So I kind of think it's evolved as my interests have evolved and obviously how society has evolved. And what's changed most fundamentally is the medium. Not the message, I would say.
Right.
So my message has always been, let's understand how society is operating better, helping you understand how society is operating and working and evolving differently. But I used to just do that on stage. Now I do it on TikTok. Now I do it on LinkedIn. Now I do it very soon on YouTube. So I think the medium has evolved. Is probably the most obvious answer to that question.
And what have you noticed the differences about the medium kind of changing? Because you're right, in a way you started as kind of like academic, very traditional, written, number of words, churning out, etc. And now, like you say, it's kind of distilling that down into shorter video messages.
Do you know what I think the main thing, and this is anyone that has a desire to disseminate their knowledge in a world now where we can do that in multiple ways, but it's even more difficult to get heard and be seen. I think really being able to write well, really being able to have stage presence and communicate your ideas effectively, and really be able to own video and be able to communicate on video, it's those skills are really now critically important if you have expertise you want to share. And that wasn't the case when I entered my profession.
Yeah.
And I think that's full of opportunity, but it's also really, really hard to keep going. It's quite exhausting. I've become basically a media empire. Well, not quite. And I have, and there's so many platforms now. It's exhausting, and it's no wonder creators are talking about burnout. They're talking about concentrating on singular platforms, and the ever difficult world of actually making money from sharing your expertise and sharing your knowledge.
Well, we can definitely dive into that, and I'll bring my own experiences on that. But let me ask this about you in terms of, one of the most common fears is public speaking. That's what takes a lot of your time. What advice would you give to somebody about how to be a better public speaker, but also how to have a presence? Well, let's just do that first, actually. Like, how would you advise somebody to be a better public speaker that's just getting into it?
So 100%, number one rule is think of your audience, not yourself, always. And what you want to do is make them, as Maya Angelou said, feel something rather than think something.
Yeah.
And that's how you touch them. So you have to realize what is motivating them, what is resonating with them, what are the images that will play in their head, and really think about them more than you. So not what do I want to say, but what do they need to hear? How do I add to their knowledge? Don't patronize them by giving them information they can't understand and compute, but also don't patronize them by telling them stuff they already know. Yeah. And it's pitching at that right level. And that changes depending on who I'm speaking to. Speaking to a board is very different to speaking to a group of apprentices. And it's really kind of getting in their head and trying to be guided by your audience. And the second thing is own the space, and people say that, and it sounds quite trite, but I think one of the things that I used to do quite a lot is speak very, very fast, and very light. Women tend to do this. We speak very fast and very shallow breath, and be rooted in your body. So be rooted in your breath, be rooted in your feet, and move. And therefore you automatically command a presence. And that's psychological, have the feeling that you've got a right to belong there and you've got something to say. But it's also physical as well. It's just own the space through your voice and through your posture.
And how did you find the sort of transition, or not even really the transition, but adding on video to that sense? Because from my experience, like, I have always found it relatively easy and straightforward to go on stages and speak. Never had a problem with that. I think that was because it's partly like something that was like bred from school, etc. Whereas actually speaking to video, I find really hard to do. I find that lack of another human presence really difficult, and it's taken me longer than I would, because basically it's not quite the same thing. It is different, obviously, but it's not that fundamentally different. It's just the medium that's changing.
Do you know what? Just, I will answer the question in a minute, but I had the most amazing encounter once with Meryl Streep, who played Margaret Thatcher in the Thatcher movie, and at the time I was writing a book about Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
My first book was about Margaret Thatcher. And I said, what's the biggest kind of trick sort of when it comes to being in control of the camera? And she said very, very, very calmly and patiently, have someone behind it. That was it. Yeah. And so what she did, she doesn't need to now because she's Meryl Streep and she's amazing, but for all of the young actresses that worked on that shoot, I think it was particularly actresses, she stood directly by the camera when they were supposedly talking to her. So you're not talking to the camera, you're talking to someone else. You're talking to Meryl Streep, who didn't apparently come out of character when she was playing Margaret Thatcher. But I thought that was such a really simple trick. I mean, it obviously takes someone else being there, but you can do it with a cushion. Yeah. You can stick a picture of your wife, your kids, whatever, on a cushion and have the cushion next to the camera. Or your cat, your dog. It doesn't have to be another person. But I thought that was actually a really good top trick from Meryl Streep. Anyway, to answer your question, I did find it very difficult. And if you go back through my TikTok archive or Instagram archive, you'll see how shockingly shit I was. And I think I tried to be funny. I tried to be Down with the kids. There's a lot of cringe moments. I think, like anything, and by the way, there's so much to learn. I don't think in any way I've nailed. No, I think it's evolving. What worked 12 months ago, 2 years ago, won't work now.
Yeah.
I think it's also about the topic that I'm talking about now, particularly in Meritocracy. People are really relating and resonating with it and sharing their stories. So it's not actually about me, which is quite right. It's about the subject. I think also showing that you're relaxed in front of the camera, even though you might not be. And I think if you've grown, unfortunately, darling, we're analog millennials.
We are.
You know, and so I think there's a real divide within the millennial demographic between those that grew up with FaceTime and those that didn't.
Yeah.
And who are natural in front of the camera, whereas we suddenly discovered what we look like in 2020 when we had to go on Zoom all the time. And I mean, I hate it. I mean, I still
can't pull my camera up and do hey guys, check out today's episode. It just freaks me out.
No, but I mean, I can't even FaceTime my friends, family, or kids. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. It's just, as a woman, all I do is scrutinise what I look like. So it's, for me, just no. But I think the other issue is that kind of, as a woman, some of the comments I get on social media, inevitably, right, about my appearance, which I'm presuming you don't.
No, we don't. But when we get female guests on, it does happen.
I used to do, back in the day, Sky Papers News Review with my husband, and he used to get horrible vitriolic attacks on his content, on his ideas, on his, what he was saying, and I'd look on Twitter. And all I'd get was horrible, vitriolic attacks about what I was wearing, what I looked like, how fat I was. I was pregnant. It's brutal.
Although before that, you had made a neat segue into your book, Meritocracy. How often can we get the name Meritocracy in there? Where did the idea come from? Was there a light bulb moment for it? Where was it on that journey of realisation, and how you've been adding things to kind of your portfolio? When did you think this is what I'm going to write my book about?
So, two things really. I was talking a lot to companies about something called the Great Wealth Transfer, which is, the trillions, and it is trillions of pounds that is trickling down from baby boomers to millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha. So I've always been aware of this idea of there being this sort of impending inheritance, this windfall that our generation are going to have that's going to solve all of our issues. Yeah, right.
But we're going to get it in our 50s.
And I thought so much of the debate in the 2010s was about how unfair it was to be a millennial. That was the main narrative. And we had David Willits, saying how our parents stole our future, and, all of this. And actually, I began to realise, and actually personally in the wake of my own father's death, in which I did receive an inheritance, that actually that was rubbish. Yes, there was a huge disparity between the opportunities baby boomers had and the opportunities millennials had. House prices, pensions, stalling wages, all of that story. But there was something happening within the millennial demographic and now Gen Z, which is actually some millennials are doing very well. They're doing very well, and they're the ones that have had the access to the bank of mum and dad. And that's what I wanted to kind of move the debate on from, isn't it hard to be a millennial, to actually we're doing all right because our parents have given us a load of money. And explaining that divide. And for me, I had to tell it as a personal story because I wanted to shine a light on the fact that we're really bad at talking about how much parental support we've got.
Yeah.
We still subscribe to a meritocracy. We still subscribe to the self-made man and woman, and that we work really hard. And we're very bad at talking about and being honest about how much help some of us, and not all of us, have had.
Before we dive more into that, can you explain the term Gen Z and Gen Alpha and where they come from. I think people understand baby boomer and they understand millennial. Where do those
So
come
Gen
from?
Z sort of, was, let's continue the conversation after Gen Y, because millennials, before they were known as millennials, were known as Gen Y.
Right.
And then,
Yeah.
they became Gen Z. Some of them have labelled them Zoomers because they came of age in the pandemic, really.
Yeah.
And the association of the pandemic with that sort of transition to staring at a green dot for 12 hours a day. And then obviously after Z comes A. So we've just gone
Right,
Gen
so
Alpha. I suspect Gen Alpha will be known as Gen AI.
Right, yeah.
Some people are already calling that generation. That's those born, just to be clear, after 2010 up to 2025. So we are already, some people are saying, although these are arbitrary goalposts, in Generation Beta.
Are you a fan of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future? Hi, I'm Sonny, one of the producers behind the show. Have you ever thought, my business deserves to be in the spotlight too? Well, you're not alone. Companies reach out to us all the time, asking us to create podcasts and digital video content for them. But until now, we've only taken on a limited amount of projects. But here's the good news. In 2025, we're expanding. Our production company, Boxlight, is now ready to help more businesses like yours tell their stories with high-quality, white-label content. Curious to see what we can do or how much it might cost? Head over to boxlight.io. You'll find examples of our work and even a podcast calculator to explore your options. That's boxlight.io. We'd love to help you shine in 2025. Now, back to Jimmy.
Yeah, because isn't it part of it with your sort of speciality of generations and so on, that we're clumping too many people together in generations now, bearing in mind cultural shifts happen so quickly. I mean, I always think of millennials, and we talk about you and I being analog millennials you mentioned earlier, but geriatric millennials as well. I think I prefer analog. But those born between 1980 and 1995, because technically that makes Rishi Sunak a millennial, who means that we've already had been and gone our millennial generation at the top shot. So do you think that we need to get into a position where we sort of have tighter time definitions for generations?
If I'm honest, generational analysis is an art, not a science, right?
Yeah.
Someone said you wear a beret, not a lab coat, when you're talking about generations. And that's a point. That is a point. It's arbitrary. These are made up brackets, right? And there's a whole history and sociological framework that has serious, I would argue, intellectual question marks over it.
Yeah.
What I'm interested in is how do you relate and understand people born in a different time?
Yeah.
So let's not slap labels on generations. Gen Z are lazy, entitled, and digital natives who can't deal with the real world and have no resilience. All of that kind of stuff was said about the boomers in the 60s, Xers in the 90s, and millennials in the 2010s. In fact, you can go right back throughout the ages and find young people being dismissed as lazy by old people. Funny that.
Yeah.
Right? It's not unique characteristic to Gen Z. But there is some key shifts happening that are most associated with certain generations. So, for example, if we're talking a massive expansion in higher education, it really is a millennial thing. But it didn't start with millennials. It clearly starts, in this country at least, different in the US, with Gen X.
Yeah. Because that was...
So, these change happens much slower than people think. And change is much more inconvenient than people think. Using generational brackets is a shorthand, but I'm fully aware of the limitations of using it. And you're absolutely right. Essentially, in this age where we are super conscious, thankfully, more than ever, of the myriad of things that make up our identity, whether it's our racial background, whether it's our economic background, whether it's our educational status or economic status or income bracket, there are so many things that make up us. And we're living in a hyper-individualist age where we are constantly, through our phone, through our parents, through our education system, thinking we're really important.
Yeah.
So generations, the reason why I think generations kind of rouses sort of anger and frustration in people is because, like, I'm an individual, don't bracket me. But I'm more interested in this idea of how do you step out of your time and understand someone that is born in a different time? And how you do that is understanding the context and, factors, economic, social, cultural, political, technological, that have shaped them. And there's a level of ignorance and assumption that comes with age, that doesn't come with race, doesn't come with gender, doesn't come with disability. People will say things about different generations or different ages that they wouldn't say about other groups. In the workplace, in the home, family, whatever. It's the last acceptable prejudice.
The last acceptable prejudice. And one of the big things that struck me when reading the book, which there's lots in it where I thought, well, that's obvious, but I haven't sort of thought about it in that way before, but was the kind of generational shift there has been in education, in the sense of, our parents' generation, sort of, just a couple of % of people going to higher education, and then by our generation the target being half of people. That is a huge kind of shift over a period of actually sort of 30 years or so, really not long.
Absolutely.
And how that has had kind of like an impact on the way that we see the world and the jobs that we're doing.
I think it's really important to understand that for baby boomers, and to a certain extent Gen X, although the rules of the game changed when they were midway through the journey, education benefited few, but for those through it gave them more.
Yeah.
And so, unsurprisingly, baby boomers were obsessed with education when it came to their kids.
Yeah.
And getting as many people to university. Now, that was quite right, because we were making the transition from, predominantly industrial economy to a post-industrial knowledge-based economy. We needed knowledge workers. We needed people to work with their heads rather than their hands.
Yeah.
So when Tony Blair stood up, as he did famously, and said, we're going to make a pledge to send 50% to university, the problem was with that policy was not, let's send as many people to university as possible. It was, what's the provision for those that don't go?
Yeah.
And frankly, there was nothing, which is an absolute travesty. Okay, and the education system is built for one route only, and always has been, by the way. Even when in the mid 20th century, when they brought in the Education Act, it's basically grammar schools, technical colleges, and grammar schools, technical colleges, and secondary mods, and no technical colleges were ever really sustained or built or expanded. Technical skills in this country have always been undervalued. So I digress. The whole sort of culture when we came of age was very much like, get that degree.
Yeah.
But obviously it came increasingly with a massive price tag.
Yeah.
And as the cost of that degree went up, the value of that degree went down. And the problem is that now you've got a disconnect between education and income.
Yeah.
The more educated you are doesn't necessarily correlate with your income.
Yeah.
And that disconnect has led to a huge swell of frustration amongst our generation, because we work bloody hard. We were cultivating that UCAS form from the age of 13. We were told this was the way.
But one of the things that really struck me about, because I was at school, I remember having a gap year and taking the decision to have a gap year quite late, and that was seen as shocking. It was just delaying going a year, everyone.
But also, why did we feel we needed a gap year? Because we worked so bloody hard.
Oh, well, yes, definitely.
And that's whole sort of what happened in the 80s and 90s was the sort of intensification of education and attainment culture based and rooted in individualism and absolute fear of failure and exam-based learning.
Yeah, but travel got cheap as well, right? Which was also one of the other kind of vectors.
Sure.
For that sort of. But the stat in the book as well that surprised me was that only 12% of millennials want their kids to go to university. Well, I didn't say it surprised me in the sense of I can totally believe it actually, but I thought, gosh, that is a real change again in the space of 15, 20 years.
I mean, I tried to find more evidence of that. I mean, I think beyond that stat and beyond anecdotal, because it's definitely, I have 2 kids, I can sense amongst our generation, our friends, which, let's be clear, is pretty siloed London, metropolitan-centric view of the world. Our generation are thinking differently about education, its price and purpose for our kids, for 2 reasons. We worked hard, or for those that didn't fit in that system, we were either excluded or the rewards didn't come that we thought would come. The second thing is AI actually is completely at odds with the mass standardization, the mass education, the standardization that comes with mass education. So school is all about standardization. It's all about let's fill you full of knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? And the key thing about AI is we're going to try and need to outpace AI, particularly Gen Alpha, right?
Yeah.
And we can only do that by learning how to learn, not learning what to learn.
And so therefore that tees up the next topic of what do you think Generation Alpha, those that are currently at school, will need to learn? Because our education system has been crap at adapting to knowledge, and you can argue hasn't really made the kind of leap to the internet generation particularly well. What do you think we need to be teaching kids now?
So I think the first thing we need to accept is that school isn't the only place or even the most important place for learning, right? That hasn't really been the case for 15 years.
Yeah.
And the education system was founded in the 19th century and is still largely stuck in the 19th century. So I think whilst there is amazing things done at school and it's the key place of socialisation, that's really important. But in terms of skills needed for the workplace, as it were, I don't necessarily think we should throw all our eggs in that basket. We have obsessed with school places and academic excellence and CV building for young people for so long. And actually, I don't think that's really what our Gen Alphas need. Secondly, we are moving away from the career ladder. So for various reasons, the career ladder is in decline, but the art of mastery has never been more needed. Because, as I say, in the age of generative AI, we're all going to have to be not just experts and masters of something, of a niche, right? But we also have to continually be learning and outpacing AI. So again, it goes back to that thing is we need to teach our kids how to learn, not what they should be learning.
Yeah.
And so that agility. And what do we mean when I say, how do we learn? Well, we learn from concentration. What's the biggest thing we've all, dipped the last 10 years? Concentration. We've lost the art of concentrating. It doesn't matter what you're learning. You need concentration to learn. You could be learning how to edit a YouTube video or Pythagoras theorem, but without concentration, that ain't going in.
Yeah.
The second thing is collaboration. We learn best from others, which is why it's madness that school is so individualized.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, I think it's really important that we essentially learn how to market our expertise, because if we are moving in a careers space now where we don't have jobs for life, we don't even have careers for life, but we potentially have skills we can monetize, and so we need to turn our mastery, our expertise, into someone else's need. And that doesn't mean hustling all the time. That might mean you're working for one company, in a small group, with a small business, or even a company for life that you're doing lots of different jobs for. But we need to be able to sell our skills and market our skills in an increasingly crowded environment dominated by AI. So sales and marketing, not taught in school. I'm not trying to turn all these little bots into, all these little Gen Alphas into apprentices, would be sort of Alan Sugar apprentices. But I do think teaching entrepreneur skills in school and in life and getting people out to work, selling and communicating with other people so that they buy into that person or buy their product is really critical. And it's not because we're creating a nation of entrepreneurs. You will create a nation of solopreneurs. And essentially that's what we're going to have to do. Some will go on to build businesses and teach their mastery to other people and create a collection of cleaners, a collection of drone engineers, a collection of businesses.
Yeah.
But we all need to think like that in order to be able to communicate, sell, market, disseminate our knowledge. And that knowledge is no longer prescribed, no longer fixed, no longer, I would say, in certain professions. That knowledge has got to be much more agile, much more fluid.
How have you learnt it? So that's one thing in terms of what Gen Alpha need to do, but one of the stats that I am trotting out a lot at the moment in the World Economic Forum report on jobs of the future was that 40% of skill sets are going to be out of date in the next 5 years. And I can totally see that, right, with AI coming and so on. But also I think, I've been in the working world 15 years. Jobs completely different to, what I was doing. And I think most people's jobs, whether they're lawyers, accountants and whatever, would have shifted a huge amount in that time. So how have you learned to learn?
Okay, there's a really practical thing here I would suggest. It goes back to concentration.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we're trying to learn something, first of all, you've got to, steal from others, right?
Yeah.
So basically pillage the people that you're aspiring to be or the thing you're aspiring to do. Just, find the people that are doing it best. But the second thing is concentration. And, I've just written a book, most of which I wrote out of office hours because I was running a business. I've got 2 kids, trying to maintain some sort of form of well-being in there as well. So how did I do that? Well, I literally 2 hours a day, quite often between the hours of 8 and 10, I would lock myself away. Luckily, I have an office in my house. And I would put on white noise, often rain or waves. And I would put on a timer. And I would start by writing, doing nothing but write for 20 minutes, sometimes 30 minutes, 40 minutes. I would build up and build up and build up. By the end, I was writing solidly for about an hour.
Would you just go for as long as you could?
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to do anything. I couldn't go to the toilet. I couldn't make a coffee. I would just write. And the issue for me is that when in the workplace do we do that level of concentration, that level of focus? I mean, I don't want to bore people with my productivity hacks, but I do think it's genuinely problematic for us all.
Yeah.
That we're not very good now at concentrating, and that's how you learn. And the second thing is the collaboration point. And I'm afraid in the era of hybrid working, we're collaborating less. And so that learning through osmosis, not even collaborating, like watching someone. I bet in your first job, you watched people do the thing that you now competently do.
Yeah.
And that connection, that learning, that watching, observing isn't happening to the same degree.
But how are we going to collaborate more in a world of solopreneurs?
Well, when I say solopreneur, I don't mean you're not collaborating, because quite often actually you probably are, but you may only be collaborating on a project for 6 months.
Yeah.
3 years. What I'm suggesting is that the idea of a career path is, I don't think, going to be something our kids see. We will, because change happens much slower than we think it does, right? The next 20 years we'll see still. But even being a lawyer, the notion of billable hours, look at how that's going to be disrupted with AI. You know, and even, as a doctor, diagnosis, look at how it's not just going to change your day-to-day job and how you do it, but fundamentally and inevitably, it's going to change the career path.
How will billable hours be disrupted by
So
AI?
most lawyers charge by the minute.
Yeah.
and most projects are working on a hierarchy where there's an assumption that there's a whole team of minions buzzing away, checking documents, and those are all automated. So I think the point is the pressure will come from clients saying, well, how much of this is now being automated, or how much time are you saving now doing that? Anything now based on human time, okay, and it's not just billable hours, there's all sorts of elements to this. Any product based on human time that can now be either automated or, on any kind of level, is put into question now. And companies, particularly small businesses, should be thinking about that.
So I sort of agree with that. But then I also think we've had lots of automation. We've had the internet has made a lot of that kind of easier as well. And actually sort of billable hours still hasn't gone away.
I don't think they'll go away.
No,
just to be clear, I think it will complicate the process, because actually what you will find, and I was speaking to a senior partner at a law firm in London a couple of months ago, is he was saying, the lawyers of the future are going to be the ones that are great, absolutely great at being with clients.
Yeah.
The personal skills,
not...
the soft skills. And lots of people say that, what is it that humans can do that AI can't? Well, business is all about trust. Trust is all about connection. It's all about building human capital. It's all about building social capital. So how can humans actually be better at being human. We've basically, you know, roboticized humans in the workplace in the last 20 years. We're going to have to rehumanize them. What's the 3 things that humans can do that AI can't? I would say number 1 is teach.
Yeah.
Number 2 is care. Okay. And number 3 is communicate and convince. And I think those sort of 3 elements, if I was to say, you know, what do professionals look like in the future, I would say it'd be excellent at those 3 things.
What do you think that people are going to do at the beginning of their careers then? Because take the example of lawyers, investment bankers and so on, like a lot of their 20s is doing the kind of grunt work and so on. And Tyler Cohen talks about a lot of it, what they're doing is being trained up for their stamina, right? And like weeding out like who doesn't want to do it, etc.
Yeah.
And I know you go in and speak to a lot of firms about this and how they can kind of retain talent. But what do you think the you know, all those points that you make there, I'm in agreement with, but that isn't something that somebody can really do a lot of in their early to mid 20s.
So I think that's a great question. So how much of the grunt work do we still have to do to learn the thing and become the master in the age of AI? So law firms are grappling with this right now because, you know, if you automate all the stuff that the paralegals do, you run the risk of getting things wrong, of course, but you also run the risk of not actually training lawyers or training people to do the thing that you want them to do, or at least oversee AI do the thing that needs to be done. And trying to work out what balance is, how much grunt work do you need and how much can you outsource, is going to be one of the major critical business decisions in the next 10 years. So how do you train people enough? And the 2 things guiding that is how much can you trust the tech? And secondly, will you get the best talent if you have too much grunt work?
Yeah.
Because you're already getting young trainee lawyers going, they've got better AI.
Yeah.
I want to work for that firm because they're doing the more interesting stuff because they've outsourced the grunt work.
Yeah.
So there is a sort of a real balance to be had.
Because one of the examples I give of AI and buying houses and so on, right, is like that trying to buy a house now, like, takes so much paperwork and so many emails, and yet the process for buying a house is getting longer and longer, right? And it should be, in theory, quicker and easier to do that. But because we're making so much regulation, because there's so much money laundering things now, is that essentially we end up kind of like creating work, and AI ends up sort of, AI technology just generally ends up creating work. And I think it's one of these weird sort of examples of things where it just sort of like, you know, the opposite can be true at the same time. Yes, our lives will get easier and it'll be able to do more of it, but as we are humans, we will also end up creating it.
Yeah, but I think you're under the illusion that technology saves us time. I mean, it creates more burdens than it eases. And I think that's true. I was listening to your Tony Blair podcast. You know, he's a great optimist about AI, as am I. You know, I'm a big fan. But he's very much in the line of, you know, it'll create more jobs than it destroys. And I'm of the view that it'll create more burdens than it resolves.
Yeah. I tell you what, I was impressed, and what I was asking him partly in that interview was how he had learned all about AI, because actually the stuff in the book was really good at the history of AI and so on, and it would be easy for Blair to get somebody to be like, write me the history of AI and how it's done and whatever, but it was very interesting talking to him, and
he's clearly got the ability to concentrate.
But I think
actually, I mean, he's in his 70s now.
Yeah, right.
And I think that sparks a really important point here. Is that we're an aging workforce, we're an aging society. Staying agile and staying on the learning track post-40 is really hard because A, you're assumed to know what you're doing, and B, there's no infrastructure for you to learn.
Yeah.
Right, there's no money for you to learn. It's really interesting when I go into companies. Who do I stand up in front of?
Yeah.
Senior partners, the C-suite or the board, or new graduates. Everyone in between is kind of left to sort of know what they're doing. And actually, if we're talking about the multi-generational workplaces, the people in the middle, and particularly the people in their 40s and 50s and 60s who are not on the leadership track that are critical bridges in that multi-generational dynamic. But Tony Blair's actually, you know, a sort of beacon of positive aging and constant curiosity, because we are going to need to stay focused and keep learning and upskilling, because we are massively de-skilling at the rate of knots right now, all of us.
Yeah.
And in an aging society, we need those post-40s, that post-40 workforce to adapt and keep learning.
Post-40 workforce.
No, because I tell you why I use post-40, because ageism in the workplace starts at 40 for women, 45 for men. And so millennials, I'm afraid, are now victims of ageism, whether they like it or not.
That's extraordinary.
I know, is it cut deep?
Couple of years it will do. One of the things that also struck me in the book, where I was like, had one of those kind of like revelatory, oh yes, that's obvious moments, but how interesting, was you talking about how Margaret Thatcher focused on the young. And I thought, gosh, that's like, that was true. And they all ended up being Thatcher's children to some degree. But because I thought, gosh, that's a sort of flip parallel of where the Conservative Party finds itself now, of generally...
They followed that demographic through.
But that's the point, then you sort of think about it.
Stayed loyal.
Exactly. And that is because, but it's demographics, right? Partly.
Yes.
It's like, because it's the biggest generation, they've got the most votes, they've got the most swing power, and it's not going to be changing for the next 10 to 15 years either.
My first book was on Margaret Thatcher in politics of the 80s. So I sort of like to think of myself that at one stage, probably not now, I was an expert on that era. And yet, of all the books that I read, frankly, the documents I read on that period, no one mentioned the demographics.
Yeah.
And yet, it's such an important point. The baby boom bulge and Thatcher's response to that, to changing demographics, and obviously finding North Sea oil, that helped.
Yeah.
And the sort of disregard she had for essentially, I would say, the over 40s, that hit particularly the deindustrialised deindustrialisation of Britain hit the over 40s more than the under 30s, right? And they were sort of left on the scrap heap, brutally, absolutely brutally. And the money, the investment, the opportunities went in the under 30s, and that's been the complete opposite since 2010 when the Tories, came in.
But if I was going to sort of like look at the book and sort of think, one of the things that I kind of came away from it thinking was like, aren't we all being a bit too doomerish on this? Like, because there was a very interesting bit where you were talking to Alex Smith, who I like and thinks great thoughts, etc. But you say the words like, where it all went wrong for our generation. And I was just like, but hang on, like, it hasn't all gone wrong for our generation, I don't think. And part of that was me thinking that a lot of the book focuses on finance, but also on property, right? And it's like, and I totally get property's got loads more expensive, and we can dive in to quantitative easing and all that stuff of why that's right? But like, that's basically why it's happened, and we haven't built enough houses because of NIMBYism. And I just thought to myself at the end of it, I was just like, but actually our generation has had it amazingly. Like, we walk around with the world's information in our pockets, we have more entertainment, we're better connected to each other, we can call our parents, we have closer relationships with our parents and family members, etc. I was just like, life is so good, yet we have this sort of slight mentality of, because of the financial crash, because of Brexit, because of the pandemic, that it's all been so difficult for the millennial generation. And I just don't, it struck with me a bit.
So, okay, great point. And I think you're right. Sort of, I think those that will reap the benefits of the 21st century will not be us. It will be Gen Z. Because they don't have the hang-ups of the 20th. We were sold a promise by our parents, by our teachers, by governments, which was work hard, do well in school, get to university, you'll be on some sort of track that ends in home ownership, financial stability, and, that's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That capitalist and Thatcherite, because it was, dream has not worked out for us, right? And that's the truth. Unless, two things.
Yeah.
Unless you've done very well outside of London.
Yeah.
because there are really important pockets and stories in the book that I identify as what I call the meritocratic millennials.
Yeah.
Or you've had the bank of mum and dad.
Yeah.
And I think the problem, I guess what I'm saying is that there are sort of stories that counteract that doom cycle that our generation is synonymous with our generation. But I think we have to be honest about that. I don't think we've really realised that the promises of the 20th century didn't actually come true for the generation that were born into it. And I think we've been chasing it for so long. Now, you're quite right. We've also come of age with democratization of travel, with, you know, the world's information in our pocket, with the ability to start a business, you know, with a couple of online forms. There are huge opportunities and uncertainties and chaos in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And we are harnessing that, of course, many of us, not all of us. And I think that the problem is that the government initiatives, policies and emphasis have been either sustaining the 20th century boomer dream or feeding us little tidbits going, it's coming, guys. The houses are being built. The green belt's being concreted over. And it's never really happened. So it's like this sort of dysfunctional, toxic relationship we've been in with the state and with government going, when's it coming, guys?
And I do agree with, and I think that was probably why I landed on the sort of...
Why don't we just accept we're not going to become homeowners? Talk to a Gen Zer. They have a very different attitude towards homeownership.
Well, exactly. But that was my point. But also, I think the point on higher education as well is that you can tell if just 12% of millennials want their kids to go to university. That sort of bears that out. And that is like just, you know...
Which is nonsense, by the way, because obviously more than 12% will go. I do think higher education needs reforming and the whole promise needs narrative needs an opportunity base needs expanding and changing. We shouldn't be saddling 21-year-olds with 70 grand debt. And the ones that have no debt are the ones that have the bank of mum and dad to pay for it. Yeah. And they're effectively those that have that 70 grand debt are paying more for their undergraduate and now masters than those that had... I'll stop waffling. But I think the point is that we need to actually, and this is what the book was about, was confronting the reality. Let's look at the real undercurrents that have shaped our generation. Yeah. Let's see what's really going on here, because that meritocratic myth needs completely dispelling. That inheritocracy needs uncovering, because we're really bad at talking about it. And James Sefton, an economist who I interviewed, put it brilliantly when he said, you know, we've created an economy of basically really good parents but bad citizens. And I think we have to accept that really since 2008, we've seen an economy where wages have stalled, which always hits disproportionately young people, an economy where assets have grown, and an economy where the state has retracted, the market's become dysfunctional, and the family have stepped up. Yeah. And that's, by and large, you know, something that is not a sort of big capitalist beast coming to rob the poor. It's actually a sort of, it's a quite often one, you know, a fountain of love that your parents have for you to invest in their children and help them on their way. But it's divisive. It
is. And look, I still agree with lots of what's in the book and all the undercurrents of it and so on. But I was just sort of, I just thought it could be a bit more sort of optimistic in tone about it. But also I just think that, because look, a lot of it, right, sits at the heart of this podcast, that I think if you're talented, driven and are bright, it's never been easier to make it in the world. But I realise that's like quite a small thing. So, but actually, it's the next level down of those. It is very difficult now to go from like shop floor to boardroom. And you could argue that was always difficult, frankly, anyway. Yeah. But like there was a staging path to do it, and that's why like a lot of what we do the show for, right, is because I want people to see all these amazing opportunities that are out there, because I do feel there's more opportunities than there's ever been before. There's more exciting jobs that are out there. But actually, if you haven't got the kind of social capital of the bank of mum and dad, it's harder to know that kind of stuff and so on. So that's where I just find a kind of slight.
My sort of response to that would be essentially, we can't have optimism until we sort of rip up the narratives we've been told and actually find out where we're really at. Because, for example, the lionizing of entrepreneurs. Young people are more likely to want to start a business than a band these days. There's a sort of sexiness around that kind of particularly sort of macho, heel-drinking entrepreneur, Stephen Bartlett sort of
Stop looking at my desk when you talk about
There's heel everywhere here. And it's to a certain extent, there's a lot of entrepreneurs that have been very well helped.
Yeah.
Have their first seed round was friends and family.
There was somebody on Dragon's Den the other day that was like, I've raised 200 grand from like friends.
Right, okay. So
friends and family round.
The bat, friends and family round will tell you all you need to know about the kinds of people that are making it.
The fact
in
that's
the
even
even
in our lexicon.
Exactly. Is an indication of who can afford to be an entrepreneur. Because you know what? Entrepreneurship is all about failing. Right? Most successful entrepreneurs have failed, 3 times?
Yeah.
Right? So the idea of even being an entrepreneur and sort of failing and having that ability to build, and there's implicit, there's a safety net there.
Yeah.
Now, flip that and say, well, actually, Gen Z are seeing things differently because they've grown up with a different reality, and they're looking at millennials going, you worked really hard, you got those, you did all that and you still haven't got a house. Now, I think Gen Z are really savvy and very focused on the sort of fluidity when it comes to money. They are not sold on the idea of wages alone. They are very much into multiple streams of revenue, passive incomes, a fluidity. Even on Depop or eBay, you can switch so easily between being a buyer and a seller. And it's that idea of and also obviously things like Klarna, frictionless debt. They are less likely to have actually handled cash. Their attitude towards money is very different.
Yeah.
And that's off the back of the technology that facilitates that, obviously, but it's also off the back of an economy where wages don't pay.
I agree.
I don't know if there's optimism in that, but there is. Because it's a disruption and a savviness and a subverting of the system that I see in Gen Z, I don't see as in millennials. They are slightly hamstrung by being at the fag end of the 20th century. And I would class them as like the Edwardians in the 20th century. Still sort of hang in their Victorian corsets, still harking and holding on to Victorian values, even though they're in a different century. That is millennials.
I agree with a lot of that. And I think one of the interesting observations that I have about entrepreneurs, having sort of done 200 of them now on the show, is that they either tend to come from the working class or the upper classes. So the upper classes can afford to be entrepreneurs, can afford to take the risk. Working classes can't afford for it to go wrong. And there is difference between the two. But actually, there are very few middle class entrepreneurs, because they are taught, and I think it is a millennial trait now, having spoken about it, but it's taught to be safe and it's taught to get the education, get on the thing, and that being part of your book. We didn't actually talk about the new class structures, but we'll get you back on another time to do that, because you and I can always talk for ages. And you are going to interview me now for the 200th episode of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. So come back.
Turning the tables.
Turning the tables, turning the mics around. So come back for that if you want some more. But the book, Meritocracy, is brilliant. I really enjoyed reading it, and I thought it made loads of really good points and so on. And it's like, in terms of that sort of like sociological look at the United Kingdom and the world more broadly, because actually a lot of it does mirror across the world. We should say that as well. Like it's a really brilliant read.
Thank you, darling.